Good morning. I hope everybody had a good weekend, and I hope you're all ready to start this novel that we're going to be going through for the next couple of weeks. The novel, as it says here, is Ordinary Grace, and this is an introduction. And in a lot of ways, I'm going to be giving two introductions. The beginning part of the next presentation also, I think, will function as an introduction, as I'm going to try to set up some context in that one. Please remember that defining grace is going to be key. And we have several definitions. The first one is elegance or refinement of movement. We talk about a dancer being graceful. To do honor or credit to someone or something by one's presence. You grace me by coming to class in the morning. You grace me by at least pretending to watch these videos and writing these comments. You're doing honor or credit to someone or something just by showing up. There are also some religious definitions. The one I think we're most familiar with is the short prayer. There is this unmerited divine assistance. There is the idea that grace is a virtue coming from God. When you were a little kid and your mother was mad at you and she was about ready to, toss you from the third floor window, she might ask for grace to get through the situation. She might, pray for a little bit of help. And there's the state of sanctification enjoyed through divine assistance, living in a state of grace. With the exception of the short prayer, I think it's important to understand that when one is talking about grace, and whether it's that physical concept of being able to move gracefully, something that I've never been able to do, or whether it's living in sanctification, whether it is unmerited favor from God, there ain't nothing ordinary about grace. And so when we're dealing with this title, grace is something that's a long way from the ordinary. And so I think we have to look at this title and try to puzzle out what possibly can be going on in the novel. We've done that once already. If I can go back to teacher school and talk about accessing prior learning, in the novel The Life We Bury, characters figuratively buried their lives. All right. Carl buries his life in prison. All right. We have the past life of a rape victim being buried. We have, you know, Joe burying the horror of watching his grandfather die. We have people dying and being buried, literally. We had snow burying everything during that great blizzard. And if we take a look at Henrietta Lacks, the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks, well, literally she wasn't immortal, but her cells may be. They seem to be keep regenerating time after time after time. And from the reading you guys had to do for the writing, that family conflict, the life of that family conflict may last another generation or two or three. It well may be immortal. And so when we're taking a look, it's important to remember that the title is going to have some meaning associated with the contents of the book. And so if we wondered what life was being buried in The Life We Bury, we wonder what kind of grace is being accessed and how we can go from the divine to the ordinary. And as you're reading, I think it's important to take a look at the multiple meanings of the term grace and how those multiple meanings might be ordinary and might be extraordinary. And as we think about the definitions, which one of the ordinary ones can turn into something extraordinary? How can one of the ordinary definitions of grace provide the depth that would make this book worth reading. Please remember that we're going to keep working on character, connection, conflict, and theme. And when we look at character, we're going to look at how we determine what kind of people these characters are. That determination is going to be made by what they say, what they do, how others react to them. Just as we determine character in people we meet in real life. The connection, what can we connect the novel or the characters to? Can we connect it to elements of our lives? Can we connect it to things we've read prior? Can we connect it to other things we've discussed in this class? Conflict is simple. There are internal conflicts. There are external conflicts. Which types of conflict do the characters face here? Theme is the underlying point the author might be trying to make, and it's just asking the question, what's the point? So as we're going through this novel, we're going to be looking at what does grace have to do with anything? How do the characters access grace? What type of grace do they access? And how can it be ordinary when it's dealing with a lot of these divine terms in its definition? And then how does grace and the characterization and the conflicts lead us to a theme that allows us to try to understand the point the author is trying to make? I think I want to add a new C to all of this. And that's the context. As I said earlier, we were going to talk about that. Context are the parts of a discourse that surround a word or passage and can throw light on its meaning. And so as we start talking about context, I think the first thing we have to look at is the exposition of this novel, and that exposition includes the setting, the time and place of the novel. I think 1961 takes us back a long time. All right. I was, 3 or 4 years old, depending on what month we're talking about. During the summer of 1961, I would have been 3 years old. The narrator's much older than I, he was 12 or 13. The events are personal, but we have to add to the context that this narration is told years after the events occurred. And I think it's important that time allows people to develop a sense of context, to create this sense of context, and to understand that the immediacy of a situation produces one vision, time produces a second. So context, I think, matters, especially when we're dealing with something as complex as grace. I also think we have to put context together here for the 1960s. I think in the 1960s, when people think about the 1960s, they think about the weird dress, the bell bottoms, the short skirts. Some of you might historically think about the moon landing that happened in 1969. You might think about, a lot of things like that. But I think the 1960s have this weird dichotomy that's involved with them. All right. And I think as we think about that dichotomy, there was Woodstock, there was the Summer of Love. There was also Vietnam, and there was Watts. All right. So while you were thinking about love, you were also having a war where people were dying, and it was the first war to be televised, basically. People could tune in at the 6:00 news and watch the violence in Vietnam, and there was at the end of every week there was a death toll. It's something I think we're familiar with COVID. It was the same thing with Vietnam, and certainly we can talk about Woodstock and peace, love, rock and roll. There were Watts and tons of riots and tons of violence. There was a dichotomy in pop culture. You had Merle Haggard being proud of being an Ogie from Muskogee and the country music fans not liking all of those hippies. You also had Johnny Cash going to the White House in April of 1970, but also releasing the song What is Truth, which was almost an anti-war anthem, as much as Ogie from Muskogee was an anti-hippie anthem. You have those two elements of pop culture colliding. You also have Barry McGuire singing Eve of Destruction, and you have the Beach Boys singing Good Vibrations. Those songs came out within a year of each other. You have a dichotomy in the 1960s that I think affects our memory. And I think a lot of the current political battles we're fighting right now are attempts to rehash the political battles of the 1960s and have a different outcome. But that's committing politics without a license. We'll move on from that. I think, however, the dichotomy that we have to have the most of is this was 1961. And if you look at if you remember the pictures from the previous slide of 1969, and you look at these pictures from 1961, things changed a lot from 1961 through 1969. In addition to the rock and roll and the Beatles and being on the Ed Sullivan Show and all of those sorts of things, you were also dealing with people kind of escaping the 1950s and moving into what we tend to think of the 1960s. But 1961 was on the cusp of all of that. 1961 was before the Kennedy assassination, before the Martin Luther King assassination, before the Bobby Kennedy assassination. All of those things that shook people in the 1960s. Vietnam. 1961 was before that. And so you have, I think, a dichotomy of a kid coming of age in 1961, losing his innocence in 1961, and that losing of his innocence in 1961 kind of presaging the loss of innocence that the United States would have in, the latter part of the 1960s. Baseball was new to Minnesota. It's one of the lines early in the book, or implied early in the book. And I can kind of understand that. Harmon Killebrew and Bob Ellison were my first sports heroes. And I think that baseball, in a lot of ways, acts as a soundtrack for this novel. There'll be a link to a George Carlin video about baseball and football in the description box. Watch that video after this presentation. In that video, I think Carlin explains why the baseball soundtrack matters. And I think that the baseball soundtrack, as opposed to the football soundtrack, or as opposed, it's, I think, the same as if I would say it's a country music soundtrack from the 1950s, as opposed to a hip hop soundtrack from 2020. Those are two different soundtracks. And I think Carlin does a good job of explaining the difference between baseball and football and why the baseball soundtrack matters for this novel. I think there are some rules to life. Rule number 1 is never follow a better comedian. And that's especially true if you're a non-comedian, and that's where I fall into. So to summarize, the novel is going to deal with grace, and it's going to deal with grace in multiple ways. It is going to deal with innocence, and it's going to deal with the loss of innocence. Context is going to matter as we go through this discussion. I'll just point out that since I mentioned that baseball was a soundtrack for the novel, the author's posted his own playlist for the novel. If you want to find it and enjoy it, you can. If you want to ignore it, feel free. Finally, let's get to the daily writing. Make sure you listen to the Carlin video. And what are 3 contrasts between baseball and football according to Carlin? That's all we've got for today. Please remember we've added the context to the C's. Hope everybody has a good week. And very, very quickly, check, I sent out an email yesterday. Double check that email for who's in class and who isn't. And double check that email also for who's in the writing lab on Friday. Everybody have a good week, and we will talk to you on Wednesday.